research biologist with the Forest Service. She holds a master's degree in forest ecology and more recently completed a PhD in watershed science from Utah State University, studying the intersection of hydrology and forest ecology at the catchment scale. Her work focuses on leveraging large geospatial analyses to piece together the big picture in western forests, and her recent findings about the complicated relationship between forest disturbances and river flow have sparked considerable interest as communities in the western U.S. grapple with water overconsumption and record droughts. Dr. Goeking is also a backcountry skier, and she will be skiing up Baldy after the luncheon today, if any of you want to join her. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank all of you for being here. I know that you have a lot of ways you can spend your time, and I appreciate you spending the time to come listen to me today. I'm going to be talking about forests as water towers, or more accurately, a question: forests as water towers, and talking about what I've learned about how forest change can affect water yield in arid and semi-arid regions. Oops. Try to go one slide at a time. So my work looks at these two main questions. So how do forests affect our water supply? And given the prospect of changing forest conditions in the future, what are those forest changes likely to mean for changes in our water supply? So in the US, more than 50% of our water supply comes from forested watersheds on federally managed lands. So this is an important societal issue. We've also seen a lot of forest disturbance and tree mortality across the West in the last 2 decades. And that mortality has been driven in part or exacerbated by warm temperatures that are likely to continue in the future. So that raises the question, what projected future conditions are likely to occur at the interface of forests and water supply? So before I dive into the details, I wanted to just give you a preview, the main points of what I'm going to talk about today. The first one is that following disturbance or forest cover loss, water yield sometimes increases, but in some cases it doesn't change, and in the most arid watersheds, it actually has decreased in some situations. Snowpack also may disappear earlier following forest cover loss or disturbance. The direction of stream flow change, and when I say stream flow, I mean water yield, water supply, water into the Great Salt Lake. Those are all fairly synonymous at the catchment scale. The direction of change in stream flow depends on the interaction of forest cover loss and aridity. So I found that arid watersheds are the most susceptible to tree mortality and forest disturbance, and those are the same watersheds where stream flow is likely to decrease following forest disturbance. So given all of these findings, my last point is that managing forests for water yield is not likely to be successful in all environments, and especially not in the most arid watersheds. So you might wonder, given everything I just said, why would anyone think that forest cover loss or disturbance or forest thinning, why would that lead to increased water yield? There is a lot of research supporting that idea. So going back about 100 years, there have been many studies that found that as forest cover decreases, water yield increases. So kind of in the shape shown by this is sort of a cartoon of the relationship that I've drawn here. Alden Hibbert nicely summarized what forest hydrology knew in 1967, and what he wrote has kind of been the status quo. It's been the conventional wisdom for decades. So that was the first statement. Reduction of forest cover increases water yield. The second is sort of the inverse of that establishment of vegetation on sparsely vegetated landscapes will decrease water yield. So same relationship, just moving in the opposite direction. The third point that he made is that the response to treatment is highly variable and the most part unpredictable. And for the last several decades, most forest and watershed managers have focused on the first 2 points and not this third point. This third point is where I've been spending most of my research time. So I mentioned that there's a good basis for these ideas. There's a lot of research showing that in many areas, reduction of forest cover does produce more water. Most of that conventional wisdom was established in wetter watersheds with denser forests than most of the watersheds that we have in Utah. So this is a picture of the Fool Creek Experimental Watershed in Colorado. In this watershed, there were actually 2 of them. I'm showing one watershed here. The one next to it was paired. They were considered paired watersheds, and it was a before-after control impact experimental design where both watersheds were studied and stream flow was measured for several years. So then these graphs, let's see, does this actually have a, no, I'll just have to describe. The lines that show the relationship, that's the relationship between the control and the treatment watershed before treatment. So you see there are trees there, and then there was a treatment that was done. So here you have no trees, and in the picture you can see that the treatment was a bunch of clear-cut timber harvests. Then they looked at, okay, here was the initial relationship, and afterward the relationship looked like that. And the difference between the two was assumed to be the amount of increased water yield that happened as a result of the timber harvest. This happened in a lot of fairly wet, densely forested places. The main reason for that is because the trees that were removed are no longer transpiring, they're no longer catching snow. And in places like Fool Creek in Colorado, between 30 and 50% of all the snow that falls can actually be lost to sublimation. So that's no longer available for runoff. So given that research, we know that forests affect the partitioning of precipitation into runoff versus evapotranspiration, or ET. They do that by blocking solar radiation, blocking wind, intercepting precipitation, and also by taking up water from the soil. Following tree mortality, turbulence increases, winds increase. Evaporation is partly a function of winds, so that's important for the hydrologic cycle. There's also more solar radiation getting through the canopy after these trees die, as well as more precipitation as throughfall that then can reach the ground surface. If you think about the other vegetation, it's also able to get more sunlight, and so often when you have mortality like this, the surviving vegetation transpires more. So you have transpiration that went down from the canopy, but it might have gone up from the other vegetation. Soil evaporation may also increase. Given the conventional wisdom, the scientific community had some expectations about what would happen when we started seeing broad-scale insect epidemics and drought-related tree die-off in the 2000s and 2010s. So over the last 20 years, trees have been dying at a faster rate than in the previous several decades. There's a lot of good forest information to show that increase in mortality. The expectation was that that increase in mortality would have the effect of more precipitation making it into our streams and our water supply. After about the first decade of this increased level of tree mortality, studies that were monitoring watersheds with things like the mountain pine beetle epidemic started reporting that they were not finding these expected increases in stream flow. In some cases they weren't finding any change, and in a few cases they were even finding less stream flow, so decreased water supply after the mountain pine beetle epidemic. So that raised questions about the universality of that relationship, that as forest cover decreases, you will get more water. The type and extent of forest disturbances that we've seen over the last 20 years are likely to continue into the future, and so there's been a lot of research into where and why these different and contradictory streamflow responses have been observed. This was work by Joel Biederman in Colorado. It was one of the first studies to find decreased water supply in several watersheds in Colorado after the mountain pine beetle epidemic. So this led me to think, I read this paper right when I was starting my PhD, and I began my PhD thinking like, okay, we know that as forest cover decreases, we get more water, and I really want to be able to fine-tune how we estimate the increase in water yield as a result of these disturbances. And then I read this work, and I completely shifted the focus of my dissertation to why are we seeing these unexpected responses? Why are we seeing less stream flow in some areas and not others? So that led me to address these objectives. First, to quantify the effects of forest disturbance on streamflow and snowpack in forests of the western US, and then also to look at the mechanisms that were responsible for those changes. So I did this by synthesizing 78 papers from the literature published between 2000 and 2019 on this topic, and the work has been published in the Journal of Forestry, so you can find that there, and I will show that again later as well. So diving into what we found, we looked at 78 studies in the western US, and here I've summarized what these studies found. And I want to point out that if you add across the rows the total number of studies is usually less than if you add up the other columns of increase, no change, decrease, because lots of studies found contradictory responses. So if they were looking at more than one site, they found that sometimes one type of site had an increase, another type of site had a decrease. So here, looking at snowpack, maximum snow water equivalent. So this is by convention in hydrology, this is April 1st snow water equivalent. That's assumed to be the date with the greatest amount of water in the snowpack. Not all studies found increases. 34 of them did, but about a quarter of them did find decreases in snowpack. Oops, there we go. So I don't know if there are any other powder skiers in the audience. If you are a powder skier, you probably already know what I'm about to tell you, and that is that the most snow and the best snow is often near the trees. Not under the trees, not in the clearings. And that's because near the trees have the effect of shading the snowpack. They have an effect of slowing winds, and they also are not so dense that they're catching a lot of the snow in their canopy and then either having it sublimate or offload onto the ground below. So trees have hydrologic and ecological value in that they shade the snowpack, they shade the soil, so that can slow down sublimation and melt of the snow as well as soil evaporation. But trees also emit long-wave radiation. So the image on the right here is a thermal image of a forest. The bright red vertical things are tree trunks. So trees they're absorbing sunlight all day, they're absorbing long-wave radiation from the ground, and even at night they are emitting that long-wave radiation. So the green patch that you see in the foreground is actually, that's a clearing, so that is the coldest spot in the frame. So there's this balance when you're thinking about how do trees affect snow and similarly soil moisture. They have the effect of shading it, but they also emit long-wave radiation. So they're blocking short-wave radiation, emitting long-wave. And so there is a balance between what is the net effect of that radiation. Here's some more results that we found in our review. This is a study that was done here at BYU. It was looking at post-fire snow accumulation and melt after the Twitchell Canyon fire. So in this study, this paper found that radiation affects the relationship between tree cover and snow accumulation and retention. When I say radiation, you could put the words slope aspect right there. So south-facing versus north-facing slopes, there's a big difference in the effect on the snowpack based on the incoming solar radiation. So the effect of aspect was such that on south-facing slopes, there was less snowpack on April 1st, but on north-facing slopes, it didn't matter whether you were in the burned area or the unburned area, the snowpack was the same. So basically the radiation hitting the snowpack on the south-facing slopes, there the value of the trees was shading the snowpack and retaining it. And so areas that burned and lost their tree cover, the snow disappeared sooner. On north-facing slopes, the snowpack in the burned areas disappeared less than a week earlier, but on south-facing slopes, the snow disappeared 2 weeks earlier. And that has potential implications for growing season soil moisture and recovery and regeneration of the forest in those areas. So the sooner the snow disappears, the sooner soil moisture deficits start to intensify. So if you're trying to manage forests then for regeneration and resilience, having growing season soil moisture is important, and that might mean maximizing snow retention. This is a similar study, but it was done much farther north in Canada. And the reason why I include this is because the relationships are different as you go farther north in latitude. The sun angle affects how much radiation is reaching the snowpack and how fast it's melting snow. So in Canada, aspect did not affect maximum snow water equivalent, but the forests had less snow than the clearings, and that's because of that interception effect. On the south-facing slopes, the snow disappeared from the clearings before the forests, but on the north-facing slopes, the opposite occurred. So on those north-facing slopes, there was less snow under the forests, and the fact that they were emitting long-wave radiation that had a greater impact than their value shading the snowpack on the north-facing slopes, which were already not getting a lot of incoming solar radiation. So moving on to snow, to stream flow and water yield. In our review, we found that many studies did find increased water yield in at least some situations following forest disturbance. But about a third of them did find decreased water yield, and many of them found no measurable change. So the main point here is that the stream flow response to forest disturbance was variable. So lots of studies found increases, no change, and decreases, sometimes even within the same study. And I'll also point out that of the studies that included some simulation modeling, none of the simulation models that were based on empirical relationships were able to produce the decreases in stream flow that were observed. So next we tried to figure out, well, what are the characteristics of places that have decreased stream flow instead of increases or even no change? And one of the factors that was important was whether the disturbance was stand replacing or not. So and by stand replacing, I mean, was the entire canopy killed or removed, or was there a lot of surviving vegetation? So in many cases, if there was advanced regeneration of trees, so say for example in Colorado where there was, the mountain pine beetle epidemic hit, but the beetles they didn't attack and did not kill the smallest trees. When the largest, oldest trees in the overstory were killed and lost their needles, many of the young trees, what we would consider advanced regeneration, grew so rapidly. They experienced competitive release once they were getting more sun and more precipitation getting through the canopy. So their growth rates being so fast, that resulted in a net increase in transpiration. So going back to the conventional wisdom, why would we expect stream flow would increase as a result of forest cover loss? I mentioned transpiration by the overstory. So that's shown here as T subcanopy, and then S subcanopy is the sublimation of intercepted snow. So this, keep in mind, precipitation is the main constraint on water supply. Then whatever is not lost to evapotranspiration is available for runoff. So, and these are all the components of evapotranspiration. The main ones that drive increased runoff following disturbance are the ones that I've circled here. So again, the decreased canopy transpiration, decreased sublimation of canopy intercepted snow. The other changes that increases, all the things in red that would result in more evapotranspiration and therefore less stream flow, were assumed to be fairly small increases. What we found in our review is that sites that had decreased stream flow had bigger increases in the things shown in red. So transpiration by understory vegetation, the shrubs and the young trees, increased evaporation from the soil, increased evaporation by understory intercepted precipitation, and then also sublimation from the snowpack. So it's the net direction of the ET response. Is it positive or negative? That's what determines whether or not stream flow will increase or decrease. So to summarize what we found in that review, we found that stream flow was most likely to decrease following forest disturbance in certain situations. So those situations are if the disturbance was not stand replacing. So say for example an insect that only kills certain species of trees, or drought that only affected the biggest, oldest trees. It's also more likely to occur in places where post-disturbance vegetation grows quickly or rapidly. There were some studies that found even grasses and shrubs could grow so rapidly following removal of the canopy that it would drive an overall increase in evapotranspiration and a decrease in stream flow. And then lastly, the decreases in stream flow almost all occurred in areas with fairly high aridity and high incoming solar radiation. So this last point seemed like it was a pretty easily testable hypothesis, and we decided to test that hypothesis using a broad scale analysis across 159 watersheds. So our objectives were similar in this study as they were in the first one. So we wanted to quantify the effects of forest disturbance on stream flow and test that hypothesis about the fact that aridity would determine whether water yield increases or decreases following disturbance. So as I mentioned, we had 159 watersheds across the western US. And those 159 watersheds were from an existing curated and published hydroclimatic data set. And we also used forest inventory data to characterize the forest change, the disturbance. And this work was published in Water Resources Research. So here are our 159 watersheds. There's about a little over a dozen of them in Utah. These are catchments that have USGS stream gauges with a period of record going back to at least 1980. They are not subject to major land use and land cover changes, so they're mostly headwaters areas, and they're not subject to changes, or they're not subject to trans-basin diversions, so moving water from one watershed to another. So we were combining two existing data sets, and based on the forest inventory data set, we were constrained to looking at the period 2000 to 2019. And the variables that we looked at for this, the response variables, so what is the thing that we're measuring as the output? In some analyses, we looked at the absolute annual stream flow or water yield. In some, we looked at runoff ratio, which is stream flow divided by precipitation. So what proportion of precipitation ends up as available water? And then delta Q, the change in mean annual stream flow from the first decade to the second decade of our study period. We had hydroclimatic predictor variables that came from this curated the CAMELS data set. P for precipitation, T for temperature, PET, potential evapotranspiration. And here's the one I keep mentioning, aridity. And if you're wondering exactly what aridity is, it's the ratio of potential evapotranspiration to precipitation. And when that ratio is less than 1, the system is considered to be not water limited because there is more water available as precipitation than what can possibly be evaporated or transpired. If aridity is greater than 1, that means that the evaporative demand of the atmosphere is greater than the amount of precipitation available to feed that. So pretty much everywhere in Utah has aridity greater than 1. PET is greater than P, just about everywhere. So finally, the forest variables that we looked at when we were trying to characterize forest change and disturbance, we looked at net tree growth. And net tree growth is defined as total tree growth minus volume, and it's by volume, minus the volume lost to mortality. So it sort of integrates across trees of different size. If we had just used something like numbers of trees, if you're familiar with forestry or like tree demographics, it's really common to have lots of small trees and their mortality rates are very high. The bigger trees, once a tree survives to be a big tree, the mortality rates in that size class are usually pretty low. So it's important not just to look at numbers of trees, and so we did this using volume instead. So we asked some questions here, these 4 questions, and they range, there's a range of how well they disentangle the effects of climate and aridity from forest change to look at how stream flow changes as a result of forest disturbance. The first question is just to what extent and where are there consistent trends in climatic variables? So this is ignoring the forest change effects, ignoring forest disturbance. So here we did some simple trend analysis using Kendall's Tau to look at how many watersheds had significant trends in climatic variables between 2000 and 2019. About 40% of the watersheds had significant trends in one or more of these variables. Most common was an increase in temperature and an increase in potential evapotranspiration. So PET is largely a function of temperature, so it's not surprising that those two showed the same pattern. There also were significant increases in many watersheds in precipitation. So those two things have counteracting effects though. So an increase in temperature makes evaporative demand higher, so it has a drying effect. Anything here that has a drying effect, I'm showing in red. Anything that has like a increasing water availability effect is blue. So increased precipitation, that's in blue. We did see increases in stream flow, Q, in the northern Rockies associated with increased precipitation, and then runoff ratios were sort of all over the place as we had these counteracting things of increased precipitation and temperature. So we concluded though that given these changes, the trends were not ubiquitous in terms of the precipitation trend and the stream flow trend. And we thought, okay, this is a good reason to account for these climatic effects before trying to link forest change just to stream flow. So in the next analysis, we looked directly at the relationship between the trend in runoff and net forest growth or forest change. So in the graph here in the upper left, if you remember the cartoon I showed at the beginning, showing that as forest cover increases, water yield decreases, and as forest cover decreases, water yield increases. So it's an inverse relationship. We would expect, if that is true, that most of the watersheds would be either in the blue quadrant, the upper left, or the green quadrant, the lower right. And there were a lot of watersheds in the yellow and the pink. Those are the non-conforming watersheds. So that is the space where the response to treatment or disturbance is highly variable and for the most part unpredictable, in the words of Alden Hebrew. So we looked at where these conforming versus non-conforming responses occurred. The non-conforming responses were for increases in water yield, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. And when we looked at patterns of seasonal precipitation, it looked like that was probably due to increased winter rain rather than snow. The pink watersheds are those that had decreased forest cover and decreased stream flow. And those were, and again, these are significant changes in stream flow. So the ones that are not colored, that are shown in gray, the Kendall trend test for the entire period was not significant. The ones that were significant were in the Southwest. We also found when we plotted the watersheds based on where they fall as conforming or non-conforming, disturbed versus undisturbed. The disturbed watersheds, which are pink and green, those are the ones, or sorry, pink and blue, they have negative forest growth. So that's forest disturbance, decreasing forest cover. That was in the most arid watersheds. And you see that in the lower left, or the lower right, in the box plots right here. So the pink and the blue, those are both negative forest change, decreased forest cover in the most arid locations. So in our next analysis, we accounted explicitly for precipitation and temperature to look at how stream flow has changed relative to what we would expect just based on precipitation and temperature, and then compared the expected versus observed stream flow for disturbed versus undisturbed watersheds. In hydrology, this is called time trend analysis. It's been called a few other things. That's just kind of a very quick description of what it is. If anybody's interested in the nuts and bolts, we can talk later. But the main point of what we learned using this sort of accepted analytical framework was that after we accounted for precipitation and temperature, stream flow still declined a lot of places regardless of whether the watersheds were disturbed. So we're seeing stream flow declines regardless in this analysis framework. The disturbed watersheds, in the upper map, there were far more decreases than increases. About 4 times as many, and then the undisturbed watersheds, it was almost equal. So that told me that this analytical framework is not adequately accounting for everything that is affecting stream flow response to forest cover change. So in our last analysis, we produced a model, a regression model, looking at climatic factors as well as mortality and the interaction of mortality with aridity to answer this question. We wanted to know how well does the severity of forest disturbance and the interaction of disturbance with aridity predict change in stream flow. So here you see all the variables that we included in our model. It was initial precipitation, change in precipitation and temperature between the two time periods, the mortality rate, and mortality interacting with aridity. So we found that stream flow change was a function of both climate and disturbance, as well as the interaction of disturbance and aridity. So these standardized coefficients show you what is the effect of each of these variables on stream flow. So anything to the right has a positive influence on stream flow. So mortality by itself has a positive influence on stream flow, but the interaction of mortality with aridity is negative. So as aridity increases, the effect of mortality switches from an increasing stream flow effect to a decreasing stream flow effect. And then of course we were not surprised at all that temperature has a negative effect on stream flow. We found that a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature predicted approximately a 6% decrease in stream flow, which is consistent with climate models a lot more complex than what we did here. We were really focused on the stream flow piece, but people that are just looking at climate are finding similar numbers based on temperature. So, and then of course, if it's a wet watershed, that's indicated by P1, or if precipitation increased from the beginning to the end of the study period, which is delta P, those things both contributed to higher water yield. So, and all of those variables were significant and important. So we wondered, to what degree are we seeing this in the data across these 159 watersheds, regardless of the model? These are the actual observations. So comparing 2000 to 2009 to 2010 to 2019, 2 time periods, looking at the change between them. On the x-axis here is aridity, moving from wetter on the left to drier on the right. And the y-axis is the change in stream flow relative to what it was in the initial time period. So there, anything above that dashed line, the dashed line represents the increase in precipitation that I mentioned earlier. Anything above that line is an increase in stream flow between the 2 time periods. Anything below it is a decrease. Mortality is shown with different colors here. So within each cluster, as you move from left to right, low mortality to high mortality. In the wettest watersheds, sorry, I keep looking right here and I need to look over here if I'm going to point to things. In the wettest watersheds, the highest mortality in purple, there actually was an increase in stream flow due to those higher mortality rates. As you move into intermediate aridity here, there's less of an influence of the mortality or the disturbance on stream flow. In the most arid watersheds, higher mortality is leading to less stream flow. So that's that interaction of mortality with aridity. So that is observational data. We also used our model to produce, this is what's called a fixed effects plot, holding all other things in the model equal, assuming there's not a change in temperature or precipitation, what is likely to be the change in stream flow as a function of mortality. And the different colors, the different lines here, represent different levels of aridity for watersheds. So the red is the top of the interquartile range for our watersheds. That's a aridity value of 2.9. That's a pretty hot, pretty dry watershed. That's a negative slope. As mortality increases, water yield is likely to decrease. For the wetter watersheds, water yield is likely to increase. We identified a critical value of 2.35, above which loss of forest cover is likely to result in less water yield. And I want to point out that about 20% of our 159 watersheds across the West have aridity values greater than 2.35. So about 1/5 of the watersheds that I showed on that first map are likely to have less stream flow due to forest cover loss. Okay, just to summarize that last bit before I talk about the Great Salt Lake Basin a little bit. In this analysis where we looked at our 159 watersheds, to recap, disturbance was most prevalent in the most arid watersheds. Stream flow was significantly related to disturbance and to climate and the interaction of disturbance with aridity. And we identified a threshold for predicting when and where stream flow would likely increase or decrease as a result of forest cover loss. One extra point is that higher temperatures will contribute to increased tree mortality in the future. Temperature contributes to drought die-off and insect epidemics and some tree diseases. So it's likely that we're going to see increased vulnerability of forests in arid watersheds to lots of these disturbance agents, and that those same watersheds are more likely to produce less stream flow as a result of losing their forest cover. And again, coming back to the components of ET, the mechanism there, again, is that sometimes the greatest hydrologic value of trees in really arid environments is shading the snowpack and the soil. So our current and ongoing future work is filling in the gaps between these 159 watersheds. And here I'm just showing an example of the Great Salt Lake Basin. We're using remote sensing based evapotranspiration. This is kind of like magic, I think. You know, I mean, a lot of hydrologists they estimate evapotranspiration as the difference between precipitation and stream flow, and then they assume the difference is ET. There are pretty decent remote sensing algorithms now, some using MODIS satellite data, some using Landsat, to estimate evapotranspiration across the landscape. And things like Google Earth Engine that allow you to calculate that and process the data for multiple points in time over broad scales have really expanded what we're able to do. So we're looking at both at our 159 watersheds, first to compare the water budget estimates of ET. So that's P minus Q, that's kind of the old school hydrology method for estimating ET at a watershed scale. We're going to compare it to some of these remote sensing based data sets, and then also use some Landsat based forest change data sets. So we've got lots of, like the monitoring trends in burn severity is one that uses Landsat to map past wildfires. There's also a landscape change monitoring system data set that goes back to 1984. Both of those data sets do. So we're looking at forest change and evapotranspiration change at big scales as a result of different disturbances, both in terms of type and severity. And again, and if you're wondering why I put all those words together, it comes back to the idea, you know, precipitation is the first constraint on how much water we get. ET is the second. And so if we can link ET response to forest change more quantitatively, we'll be able to better predict how future forest changes are likely to affect available water, stream flow, and how much ends up in the Great Salt Lake. Okay, so I wanted to at least touch on the evaporation problem in the Great Salt Lake Basin. So we only get so much precipitation, and if we want more stream flow, evapotranspiration is the way to deal with it, right? So the Great Salt Lake Strike Team put out a report last month, and I wasn't an author on that report because it's a policy report, and as a federal scientist, I can't be writing policy things, but I was in communication with the people working on this, and I 100% stand behind the statement that thinning Utah's forest is not guaranteed to substantially increase the amount of water reaching the Great Salt Lake. Although thinning can improve forest health and reduce the risk of severe wildfire, it does not always increase stream flow. So earlier I showed, you know, that diagram of evapotranspiration and all the ET pathways with the different arrows. This is what you can do if you move from making your own graphics in PowerPoint to getting an actual, like a real graphic designer to make a diagram. And so we got a graphic designer to make this for the Great Salt Lake Strike Team report. The main point is that, you know, on the left you have your initial conditions and you have a certain amount of stream flow that comes out of that forested watershed. if you do forest thinning, there is a chance that you will reduce transpiration, reduce interception and evaporation, and get more stream flow. There's also a chance, which is quite great in the arid environment that is Utah, that other evapotranspiration pathways will increase above the level they were at before, and that could drive a net increase in ET, and you get less stream flow. Much better diagram, in my opinion. Okay, and then some common questions about forests and water. You may have heard that Utah's forests are too dense, especially compared to the past. And I wanted to show this. Past forest management has legacy effects of what we see in Utah's forests today. This is stand age, so how old are the forests? And then this is it's just a histogram, so the height only matters relative to other age classes. Here's the Louisiana purchase. There are very few stands that old. Here's the Lewis and Clark expedition. There's more. Closure of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, when lots of trees were cut for railroad ties in northern Utah. And these are 100-year-old stands. This is the most abundant age class in Utah. It is unusual and quite unnatural to see an age class distribution that looks like this. Under natural disturbance regimes, it should be a pretty consistent, smooth graph. So what happened here? We stopped cutting trees for the Transcontinental Railroad. We started putting out every fire by 10 a.m. the next morning, and continued doing that until the last 2 or 3 decades. We started seeing natural forest disturbances and large wildfires. So that has an impact on wildfire risk and forest health. I'm going to skip to the bottom question there. Are there other benefits of forest thinning besides water yield? If we have all of our forests in these older age classes, that can be risky. That's risky for insect pests, forest diseases, and wildfire. So there might be good reasons to increase forest resilience through other management tools such as thinning. When trees are removed or die, does all of the water that they would have transpired become available for streams or for flow into the Great Salt Lake? I hope that my many arrows of the different evapotranspiration pathways convinced you that it doesn't. Just because you reduce T doesn't mean that E stays the same. Potential evaporation in Utah is really high. You can do an experiment by putting water in a pie tin, for example, and put it in your yard. And in July, it'll disappear pretty quickly with no intervention from anybody. And so that's what happens if the trees aren't transpiring that water. It's not a given that it's just going to flow into the streams. There's a good chance, especially with increased winds, increased turbulence due to thinning of the forest, increased radiation hitting the soil, that evaporation is likely to increase. A rule of thumb in wetter places is that, and a wet place being at least 500 millimeters a year of precipitation. That's a lot more than we get in Utah. That the rule of thumb is that if the place is that wet and you remove at least 20% of the forest, you might be able to measure an increase in water yield. And that is not likely to be feasible. We don't get that much precipitation here, and removing 20% of the forest is probably not feasible. I've heard another Forest Service hydrologist say, if you want to manage forests for water yield, the only way to do it for certain and to have a durable, persistent increase in water yield is to remove all of the vegetation and pave the watershed. So, take-home messages. Stream flow and snowpack often increase after forest cover loss, but in some environments, especially in the arid parts of the West, they decrease. Snowpack may melt earlier, and it may be an objective to manage for resilient forests, which might mean maximizing snow retention to maximize tree health. The direction of the stream flow response depends not only on forest cover loss, but also the interaction of the intensity of the disturbance with aridity. And I think I've hit this enough, but managing forest for increased water yield is not likely to be successful everywhere or permanent. If you're thinking, how would managers use this? This field has been changing rapidly. We've been learning a lot that has sort of bucked the conventional wisdom over the last 10 years or so. And in this arid region, both climate by itself, especially changes in temperature, and vegetation changes will affect water supply. And then finally, forest thinning mimics these disturbances that we study. The mountain pine beetle epidemic, for example, could be seen as a natural, wide, broad-scale thinning experiment, and it didn't produce the increased water yield that we expected to see. So you have been very patient and attentive, and I thank you for that. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, did you look at the type of forest, like an aspen forest versus a conifer forest, and which one had created more stream flow?
In the analysis of the 159 watersheds, we did not, but in the review paper, did look at that a little bit. For the most part, the papers that we reviewed, so there were 78 studies, and nearly all of them described their watersheds in terms of, here are the species that are there. We can do a lot better. If I was, going to try to say how can we improve our understanding of this, one of the ways would be to be more quantitative and specific about what are the things there, how much, and where. That's something that I've done some other work that I didn't present today, looking specifically at the forest type, but also I know from other studies that weren't in our review. In aspen forests, you usually get greater through-fall of snow, so greater snow accumulation, and longer snow retention, mostly because you started with more, but the aspen also have higher transpiration rates, especially early in the season. So, and because they're so patchy, I should say there have not been any studies that I'm aware of that have looked at stream flow from aspen versus coniferous forests, and I suspect the reason is because they're so patchy. You can't really find a watershed that is just aspen, or conifer with no aspen. When you think about forest resilience, having a mix is probably the most resilient thing. Aspen is more susceptible to cavitation and mortality if growing season soil moisture is depleted. So it uses a lot of water up front, and then if it uses too much and the soil dries out, then it's a problem. But yeah, there's a lot more to learn on that topic. It's a good question. Yeah.
When you looked at disturbance, was there any control for time since disturbance, or was it across a broad range of times?
It was across the board. And what we're doing now with the satellite-based ET estimates is actually creating a chronosequence of time since disturbance, and then also looking at the disturbance type.
So you're expecting a change in the stream flow, increase or decrease across time since disturbance, so it'll be initially high immediately after disturbance, lower later on?
Yes, and there were studies in the review that found exactly that. That in wetter places that did see measurable increases in stream flow after a disturbance or after a harvest, that it increased, sometimes for as little as like 3 to 6 years, and then often decreased. There are a lot of watersheds in the Pacific Northwest, very wet watersheds where there's plantation forestry, where they clear cut and then they plant usually Douglas fir in rows, and there have been a few watersheds that have been studied for decades there, and they're still seeing fluctuations, 20, 30 years afterward. One of the changes, one paper I recently read showed that even though the stream flow sort of leveled off after about 15 years at like the pre-harvest level, the seasonality was still different. There was more stream flow early in the year and less stream flow like in the summer and the fall. Yeah. Yeah, lots of complexity there. Yeah.
To bring up that question of complexity, from what I've read, in more arid regions, there's a more variable response to changes in climate or I guess weather year to year. And we have like NSO cycles going on, and then we have anthropogenic climate change going on underneath that as well. So for all these studies that you're looking at, did you try to account at all for underlying signals, right, that are not stationary in the trends when looking at that meta-analysis of the different papers?
So in just doing the simple trend analysis, we tried to first say, is there anything?
Yeah.
But that trend analysis only detects monotonic trends.
Yeah.
So not cyclical ones. So we didn't incorporate them, but looked for at least a long-term signal. The time trend analysis, the one that I said, this is it's kind of a wonky hydrology specific thing. In that one, we calibrated a model based on the first decade as a function of P&T, and then applied that model to the second decade to predict what we should have seen in stream flow, and compared the predicted to observed. So that was the closest we came to specifically accounting for those things.
Awesome.
Yeah, but I think that is maybe one area where hydrologic models might be a better tool, because you can simulate you can superimpose a cycle on your input data in a hydrologic model. So doing that with observations, I think it's a lot messier, especially when you're combining, big messy data sets from two disciplines.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think modeling would be a good way to look at that.
Wonderful.
I've more than used up all my time, haven't I? I'd be happy to talk to anybody else that has more questions, comments, ideas. Yeah.